Nachliel, welcome to the Zev Audio Zone. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thanks for having me on the show and in the zone.
What's behind you? Looks beautiful. Are you in ancient Israel?
Not that far. I'm in ancient Assyria. This is the palace of Sancheriv on the Tigris River in Nineveh.
That is awesome. Very cool. All right. Well, that'll get us into our first question. Nachliel, you're the founder of Museum Tours. Give my audience your short elevator pitch. What is Museum Tours?
Well, I say I bring the museum to life. I basically look at museums as a place where you can really have a fun time and really learn so much and see just history, archaeology, geography, Jewish history, art, and just see it all connected and come alive and come together. It's very, very experiential when you can see so many different artworks from around the world in one place. It can really tell a story in an amazing way. And that's what I do. I tell these stories.
Totally agree. I'm actually, you just awakened in me a memory. My earliest memories, like as a kid, was my mother taking me to the Met in Manhattan, the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Natural History Museum. Like it really, I think, inspired a thirst for lifelong curiosity and learning as a kid. I always loved that.
I'm a bit
So,
jealous. I discovered
yeah,
those museums just a few years ago.
right. Because you grew up in Israel, right?
Right. And I
Cool.
wasn't a frequent museum goer when I grew up.
Right. Yeah. So growing up in New York, you like take it for granted, have all these museums, all these things around you. So what were you doing before the pandemic? And if you don't mind, just maybe hold the mic up a little closer.
Sure.
Yeah. What were you
Sure.
doing before the pandemic? And then how did you adapt? Because from what I understand, you had to adapt
Oh,
pretty rapidly.
absolutely. So before the pandemic, I was guiding tours at the Metropolitan Museum, sometimes several times a week, sometimes several times a day, and occasionally traveling to other museums in the United States. When I could to Europe, when I was in Israel, it would be the Israel Museum, Bible Lands Museum. I've been to the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. I've been to the British Museum in London, and I just do museums. I've been to Canada as well, and I just explore museums and I reach out to the Jewish community and I say, here's an enrichment that I'm offering you. And sometimes I'll speak at a shul, I'll speak at a synagogue over Shabbat, and I'll route people up, I'll make connections, and then I just do tours. And that's what I was doing. And I had a lot of ideas and plans for working with the Jewish community in the tri-state area and expanding when I travel occasionally to other places. That's what I was basically doing until the pandemic hit. Once the pandemic hit, we started working with Zoom, and I was also a part-time teacher, a Jewish history teacher. So we were using Zoom a lot, and I'm like, hey, Google Street View. So I don't know where I got the idea of Google Street View. I'm sure I've seen it before. And I used to use it for planning trips to Europe and so on. So I just got the idea of let's just see what happens if I go into the museum. I'm like, oh my gosh, I know my way around these museums. I know what's there. And I started doing that. So I started saying like, hey, let's do, I think the first tour I was doing was Pesach, so ancient Egypt. So I started doing these ancient Egypt tours, which I would have been doing in the museum, but instead, not only am I doing them from where I'm sitting at home, I'm able to reach more people around the world because they're all on Zoom. So now the way I've adapted is I'm doing virtual tours, and these virtual tours give me access to more museums and more people.
That's a really creative way to adapt. I mean, did you see other tour guides were doing that, or how did you think to use Google Street View, something that I think people use in a mundane way, like you said, when they're planning a trip, to say, hey, why don't I do my Zoom lectures and tours? Why don't I combine that with showing people on Google, like these virtual, the way, if for those out there who may not know, you said, what was it called? Google Street Tour?
So there's Google Street View, which is a function of Google Earth. I mean, Google Maps, but also Google Earth, that enables you to walk around in an area that was pre-recorded either by this 360 camera recording of Google, or individuals who contribute by holding up their camera, doing a 360 and then uploading it to the cloud. I still haven't figured out how they do that. But then you can go to places that didn't have access to Google Earth, and you can still see so many different things. And there's a date of when it was posted. So you can sometimes see things that aren't even there anymore.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So, I've used this feature many times just for fun, curiosity, when it's available, and usually a well-known museum, they have that. So that's so cool. That did you just think to do that, or are other tour
Yeah.
guides?
I mean, in terms of museums, I have been on some other tours of, let's say, university professors, a Tel Aviv University 3-hour tour in the Israel Museum. Very academic. I would enjoy it because I'm absorbing material that I can later use, but I wouldn't say that that's what I do. I have a different approach. But I have seen tour guides. Tour guides are now adapting. They're going out there with drones and pre-recording videos. I mean, there are tour guides that are now making 5 figures a month during the pandemic, reaching their clients virtually. So they are catching on to this. In terms, they're just not. I specialized in museums, but I can also take you to ancient Egypt and show you the monuments in context of the museum, and that's different. I'm bringing it to life. Instead of telling you, I'm showing you. So it's given me an added value. Instead of just holding up a poster or a picture of Egypt, we can move around the globe, and I can switch the planet upside down, so to speak, so you understand Egypt the way Egyptians look at it, from south to north instead of north to south, etc.
Very
So it's,
cool.
yeah.
This is a real example. I want the listeners to know of entrepreneurial ingenuity, and this should inspire you, whether you're a tour guide or aspiring tour guide whose business or livelihood was disrupted by the pandemic, or if you're not a tour guide, you're in a different business which was more face to face, and you're a little bit have had trouble adjusting or transitioning. This should give you some inspiration. So why don't you describe a little bit the programs, the virtual tours, and the courses that you have in the works? Tell people a little bit about the different service offerings you have. And you alluded to the fact that you have a unique approach to your tours, and also who are they for? Is it just for a Jewish audience? Is it for a wider audience? Tell us a little bit about your tours, your
Sure.
programs and courses, and what makes them unique.
Sure. So my tours started off as targeting the Jewish community because I usually deal with Jewish history and biblical stuff. That's my background. But I've worked with different companies. Like, for example, there's a Chinese company which has students abroad who are coming to the United States from China, from Singapore, and they're customizing learning programs and field studies for them. And somehow they found me on LinkedIn, and I've done 3 different programs with them. One in the museum. We're talking about like one of the Fortune 500 families. I'm keeping their information covered, but I've also had 2 sessions that I've done with these students on Zoom, a 6 and one an 8-part session to help them prepare an exhibition and a portfolio for applying to art school or something like university. So I've gotten really creative. Where there's demand, I come up with it. So in my virtual tours now, on museumtours.co.il, my website now has virtual tours. One option is customize your own experience, and I list there different sorts of experience that I've done because I just say the sky's the limit. I've done stuff on anthropology, stuff on installation art, and then stuff about the Renaissance, and then something that's biblical, and something that's just for scavenger hunts for kids. So I've come up with all these different programs. So I specialize in Jewish education, but I'm trying to branch out from there. So in addition to my virtual tours, which are seasonal, so now we're about to approach the holiday of Purim, which deals with the Persian Empire, Queen Esther and Achashverosh, or Xerxes, as he's known from the movie 300, or Xerxes, as it's probably more correctly pronounced. The scope of the programs is constantly growing. I have about 14 tours on my website that are virtual, and that also includes lectures and combinations. So one of them is a new thing, a new idea that I had is called the Monthly Mystery Tour, or the Monthly Mystery Museum Tour. And the idea is that I'm going to throw you to a museum that you're unprepared, you don't know what it's going to be. Maybe it's a museum you know, but it's an exhibition you didn't know, and I'm just going to surprise you. And I figured that's a creative way to go into museums that I need to come up with an excuse for talking about. So I recently did a museum in Toronto and then a museum in Chicago, because why not? Right? I don't need to come up, wait, what's the connection? I just call it the Monthly Mystery Museum Tour. It's your roulette, Russian roulette. You don't know what you're going to get. And I thought that was a nice idea. I have several people who were on it last time, and they loved it. So they've already signed up for the next one without asking any questions and told their friends. So and that's that. I also have a podcast called Artifact Podcast, where I talk about artifacts, and I try to expand to connections to history, psychology, archaeology, linguistics. I have a partner, Mayor Panzer, Seth Panzer, who we do this together on artifactpodcast.com. And we have had 4 episodes so far. We're about to interview and be interviewed on other podcasters who talk about history. So we're kind of like, that's where I'm letting this experience from museums branch out. And I do have the hopes to be able to go into museums and speak to curators and do some interesting things in the future once we've had enough of mileage and they know what we do. So and that's pretty much what I'm offering. And there's also pre-recorded tours and actual tours in the museum. Once the museums open up and we can travel, I'm planning on getting back into the museum, and maybe we'll talk later about my future programs I'm developing. But I do have actual tours. I've done many different tours, and I work with a lot of different communities in the Jewish community across the spectrum of religious affiliation, from secular to ultra religious. I know how to work with many different people. Israeli society is a challenge I haven't met yet because we haven't had the time. The museums have been constantly closed, but I'm working on adjusting to the Israeli society as well.
That is awesome. I'm definitely going to link your website and the podcast and other things in the show notes. So anyone listening to this, you can easily find Nachliel and check out his stuff. You can see his tours and classes. And I think that's really cool, especially the mystery one, the mystery tour. I mean, without technology, you could never do that. I mean, most tour guides they're beholden to the 1 or 2 locations that they take people around, and the person sees what you see is what you get. But you have the freedom to go to almost everywhere in the world and give a tour, and even drop them in a place where they have no idea where not only what you're going to say, but where they're even going to be touring. I think that's pretty incredible.
Yeah, you have to be adventurous.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's pretty fair to say you're in a very interesting niche, biblical archaeology, Jewish history, antiquity, and giving tours and educating people about it. Very interesting niche. Share with us a little bit about your own background, what got you interested in biblical archaeology and educating others about it. Tell us a little bit about how you got into this.
That's a great question. So I grew up in the old city of Jerusalem. Just to give you an idea of where I grew up, and that will sort of begin answering the question. My parents' house is built on top of what's known as King Hezekiah's wall from 2,700 years ago, a special fortification wall made in preparation for the invasion by the Assyrian king Sennacherib, who resided in this palace in the picture behind me. So I grew up on ancient history. My father is a tour guide and a rabbi, and he recently became a certified archaeologist as well. So I sort of grew up with this by osmosis. I've just absorbed history in the streets of Jerusalem with all the crazy stories that I've heard and I've seen. I mean, people with Jerusalem syndrome, people who are, for a reference, Jerusalem syndrome is where people come to Israel, not necessarily Jewish, and they just suddenly believe that they are the Messiah or John the Baptist or something like that. And they're crazies. They just hang around for years sometimes in the park, just talking your head off about how they're the Messiah. So there's a whole ward of these people in hospitals here. So yeah, it's
we thought New York was crazy.
Yeah, you thought New York was crazy, but they don't think they're the Messiah. They just think they have the solution to, I don't know. You have the naked guitar cowboy guy. I mean, that's enough said.
Yeah.
So I grew up with that, and I've always had a tug towards teaching that way. So I started teaching a part-time job in Jewish history at a 6th grade in 2010, 2011. And they gave me history. Now I'm trained as a teacher for communications and biblical studies. I never did Jewish history. I did not like history in high school. And I started teaching, and I looked through the material. I'm like, I know archaeology about this stuff. I have coins in my house. I found stuff here. I've been to that site. So I just started sharing stuff. And I have students from then that are still in touch with me. They're out of the army now, and they're still here. They've been on my tours, virtual. So that was very impactful. I just began bringing what I learned about history and archaeology and growing up in the old city into the classroom. And that's how I kept on going. And in 2015, I stumbled upon doing a tour at the Met. I was teaching at this point, I already moved to the States. I was teaching in New Jersey at a Montessori school. And we're planning a field trip. We're going to do this trip in the Met. And I said, like, hey, let's do like half a day art and half a day something Tanakh, something biblical. And so I prepared this tour. Now, it was a very dry tour. It was a lecture in the museum. I didn't really know what I was doing, and I didn't think about it doing it again. I just went a few times to the Met and I did it. Now, to backtrack, when I came to the States, my father, who was again a tour guide and an archaeologist, urged me to go to the Met to get familiar with the material and to offer tours occasionally to educators. I didn't do any of that. I didn't have time for that. I was very, very busy teaching in a new job, adjusting to the new country, the new culture. I never did it. I only started doing it in preparing for this tour. Now, at this point, I did that tour. 2015, I came to Israel for the summer, and I decided to open a YouTube channel where I'm going to show teachers how to bring their classes to life, incorporating archaeology, history, biblical sites, and whatnot. So I've been on several archaeological digs that summer, and I interviewed a lot of archaeologists. I uploaded it to my YouTube channel. We'll link to that later. And I just had a lot of fun writing content, and I never thought this was going to turn into a museum thing. I thought this was going to be a mailing list, a subscription, YouTube's. Like, I just had ideas for that. And then I met one of my professors who I had an outstanding paper from a few years ago. I needed to talk to him. That was my last paper for my bachelor's degree way back. And I met with him and I was telling him what's going on. And I told him about this tour and I told him about the YouTube. And now he was the department head of communications. So I thought he would be excited about this whole idea of building a YouTube channel and eventually monetizing it. And he said to me, it's a very cute idea. I don't really see the value in people spending money on it. It's something cute to have. I don't think it's going to work. Fine. And then he said, but those museum tours you're doing, I think you're sitting on a treasure trove and you're just not digging down to get the treasure. You're just walking around looking for other things. You're in New York. You're not in the Midwest. If you make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. Just imagine capturing New Yorkers' attention for a half an hour in the museum. And I've done it for 2. So I just decided to do that. I made some contacts with some people I know in the Jewish world. I mean, I'm in the world of Jewish education. I said, like, hey, I have this idea. One thing led to another. My first tour was in 2016. I did a tour for Tanakh Study, who I'm now working with. I've done a podcast for them last year. This year I'm doing a video series called Archaeology Snapshot. And I did a tour for them. And I did a tour for Magen David Yeshiva High School, which is a Brooklyn-based Syrian Jewish high school. So I did a tour for 2 ninth graders. It was 46 students at the Met. And that was that. I came in, I drove in, I was living in New Jersey. I drove into New York 3 times, did a prep class, then brought into a museum. And that was that. And then they offered me a job to teach something in Judaic studies. And I turned them down because I was not going to go for a 35-minute class on a Friday with the Verrazano. It ain't happening.
Mm-hmm.
It just did not work. But then when I kept on reaching out, I was really, I was just really hustling. I just called up schools. I just made a list of schools and I called and I called and I called. I called Kushner, I called Ramaz, I called North Shore, I called everyone. And I just told them about it. And in terms of schools, budgeting and planning and scheduling, it didn't seem like anything was happening, but maybe next year. So I said, I need to be in New York. So I moved back to New York and then I reached out. You
cold called, essentially. You cold called to get.
I just cold called. I just cold called tons of people. And
just let the record show for those who say cold calling doesn't work. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry,
I mean, I must say that was after I went through a very difficult personal experience. And I said, after going through that, I can do anything. So I just said, you know what? I'm calling all of these. I called 13 or 14 or 16 schools that day. I just called and called and called. And that's it. I just told them what I do. And so I ended up moving to New York. I moved to Crown Heights, and that's eventually where we met. And and I started working at Magen David Yeshiva High School as a history teacher. And I also did some tours for them. But that one thing led to another. I just did a tour for Amaz, a tour for Flatbush, a tour for this. And then people started finding me and saying, hey, we heard about you. We want to write an article. right? And I reached out to other people. So I never really did paid advertising. I always hustled and I reached out to people and I said like, hey, how about I invite you a reporter on my tour? And if they like it, they'll write an article. So I got a professional photo shoot from one magazine because they put out a really nice spread. And then another one, and people read this, and then some girl who read it said, this is my dream job. Can I intern for you? So I just get all these people just call me. At this point, I just had someone on LinkedIn reach out to me and said, we're doing an article for the Jewish Link. So they just want to talk about it. So, excuse me. So yeah, it just became something it just became like, I've made a name for myself in this niche. And I'm sort of starting over in Israel, but because of COVID, I can maintain the connection that I've made so far.
Right, and you're able to still give the tours because they're all virtual. You can take them to Chicago, Toronto, anywhere.
Yeah. I mean, these tours, I've had people from Australia and from Europe, and I've done tours, I'm talking to Brazil now. I mean, I'm keeping certain things under wrap, but I'm talking to Christian communities in Brazil. I mean, who knows where this can go? The Jewish community and the Christian community. Like, there's a lot of people out there who don't really have access to museums and really are interested. So the Jewish community in Brazil, but then there's also, I speak fairly fluent Portuguese, and I have to learn the lingo for what I do in Portuguese, but there's a very strong clientele, you can say, a potential audience of Christians who love Israel, who love the biblical stuff. I'm like, hey, why not? Right?
That's so cool. And so you're using, you can connect with many different people. And I think that a few observations when you're talking, just one first, I know, you said you're jealous being in New York. I'm jealous of you, the old city, Jerusalem. That's amazing. And two, I think it's so cool that you said you grew up, even though your father is an archaeologist and tour guide, you didn't like history. And I'm a history lover. I think I always have been. It was like the only subject I did really well in school.
Wow.
But I think that I have a theory. Maybe you didn't like history because you lived history. It's not as it's one thing to read about it in a book. It's another thing to see and feel and touch, or at least be immersed even virtually in it. That's a whole another way to connect with it. I think that's
that's a very good point. That's really, really good, Zev. I think that perhaps because I was living history as something alive, my teachers didn't know how to do that, so they just bored me. Because I never really knew that thing that I didn't like was history, like that thing that I liked was history, rather, because they turned me off from it. But I actually had something else, and like I never knew. I'm now doing a master's in Jewish history, so like I actually really enjoy it once you find how to personally connect to it, and it's not just random dates that you have to memorize. So I guess I didn't have good history teachers. I just liked the actual experience of growing up with history. That I don't really look at it as something that happened in the past. What I say when I say I bring the museum to life, I say, like, from a Jewish perspective, I think it's a good way to understand this for a general crowd. When we talk about the Babylonian Empire in a general audience, we're talking about the Neo-Babylonian kingdom, which succeeded the Neo-Assyrian, and they were the Akkadian this and the that, and it's like, it's very intellectual and interesting. But to me, that's the destruction of the first temple. That's next to my house. And we talk about it and we read about it and we have holidays and we mourn it. We all know about Nebuchadnezzar. We all know about the Persian Empire and Ahasuerus. We all know about the Greeks. We all know about Antiochus IV. Yes, of course, we all know about Antiochus IV, right? This is this is yesterday for us. It's part of our yearly cycle. It's part of our liturgy. It's part of our consciousness. It's not something interesting that happened in the past. It's part of who we are. And that's the approach that I take when I connect people to history. It's not something interesting that happened a long time ago. It's very, very current and relevant in terms of how we deal with struggles and dilemmas and situations, and how do we deal with it? What have we created? What is the effect? Even if you talk about something that sounds as arcane as idolatry, but when you understand what drives humanity to search for security and order over chaos and struggling with nature in a pre-scientific world, you can suddenly say, like, oh, I get it.
I mean,
I
sort of
get what's happening.
I feel like exactly. You're just what's happening now. I think that really brings it home. There's a lot of uncertainty in the world, and people look for anything to try to get a sense of control or predicting what the future. And I think you nailed a really important point. It's about making a personal connection with the material. And so on this podcast, which is, focused to a pretty broad audience, and specifically on e-learning, online education.
Yeah.
I think whether you're giving tours or you're teaching employees how to sharpen their skills or about workplace policies, or if you're teaching kids math or English, you have to help the learner make a personal connection to the material. So with your tour,
Absolutely.
so you're right. So with your tours, you might have a group of kids from a Jewish school, and you're going to help them connect with it in one way, versus a Christian group in Brazil, or maybe a group of just history buffs, who maybe just enjoy biblical history because they like ancient history of the Near East or antiquity. And you're going to help each of those people connect with it on their way, on their level. And I think that's what a great teacher and a tour guide does. So I think that's pretty incredible. So yeah, what's next for you, Nachliel? What's next for you, museum tours? Where do you see yourself going over the next year? Even though I know things can be unpredictable, and where do you see this going in the future? How do you? I think it's really interesting, by the way, how that professor a little bit, he was a little bit skeptical that you could monetize your content, but he was right that you were, and it's really funny, archaeology, right? You had to dig. You were sitting on treasure.
Good one. Good
You
one.
know,
I never thought of that.
really?
I must have quoted that story hundreds of times, and I never thought of that.
That's so fun. I thought for sure that was like a pun.
Oh
But
my. That pun
yeah.
went unnoticed by the punster himself.
But and I do think you could also monetize your content. There's I think many different ways you could go with this. It's a very interesting niche. As you see, it has a lot of personal interest for people. Even me, I'm an entrepreneur. I do marketing and sales, but when I was younger, like I loved like Biblical Archaeology magazine. I loved studying. I don't know if you know who Professor Eric Klein is, George Washington University. He's a big archaeologist. I took a class with him when I was in college, and I've always liked all history, and especially ancient history, biblical history. So, where do you see yourself going with what you're doing?
It's a great question. There's so many places this can go. I've just had some new ideas that I just started doing. So start from the top. In terms of the actual product used to be tours in the museum. So one of the ideas that I had, and I'm going to sort of keep it a little bit under wraps, but we have the Abraham Accords, right? With the expectation that we're going to have a lot of tourism coming in from the United Arab Emirates and so on into Israel. And I'm saying, okay, what can I do with this crowd in the museum that's unique? So I'm developing a tour in some museums in Israel, which can really deal with that crowd and talk about sharing a Jewish perspective, but also talking about shared values of the Abraham Accords. So we're talking about Islam and Judaism in some very interesting ways, and I'm developing that. Right now, in terms of the time I'm investing into it, it's sort of on the shelf because right now the virtual tours are important, but it's there. So that's something I'm looking into, as well as reaching out to more of the community in Israel. And I was thinking one idea that I had is that in the museum, I'll have to tell a story to explain this, but I think that in the museum there's a potential for neutralizing animosity about hot topics in religious and maybe political areas. Perhaps maybe that's a bit too ambitious right now, maybe not. But in the museum, you can get people into the environment where they can have a conversation about something, but their guard is down. Because we're just talking about how something in antiquity happened. We are not imposing what you should be thinking now. And then you can say, hey, let's talk about something. So the story that I always go back to is in one Passover, one Pesach tour in the Egyptian galleries at the Met, I had 35 participants on this public tour. I had a 5-year-old kid, an 82-year-old woman. I had a Reform woman rabbi and a Hasidic family, and we were all in the same room. And I was able to guide a conversation about the covenant with Abraham over the land of Israel through the context of ancient Egypt. And I'm wondering to myself, how would you get these people to ever be in the same room and in the context of hearing Torah and hearing something that they like? How is this happening? But there's some magic in the museum that is able to do that. And obviously a lot of it has to do with the guide and the setting and the energy. But at the end of the day, the museum is a way you can bring people together. And so I have this vision of doing things in the museum that are relevant to current Israeli issues, whether it's Jews and Arabs, where there's a lot of people who are on the cutting edge of dealing with that, Rudy Rockman, and there's a few other people, right?
Yeah,
So I
he's great.
actually, I spoke to him once, and we never followed up because Corona, but I have ideas once the museum opens up, once we can do things. And there's other people who are doing things like this. I'm one of the reasons I'm studying Arabic here in Abu Tho is for that. I want to be more involved, to speak better Arabic, to understand the culture and make connections. So that's actual tours. And of course, expanding what I did in New York is just reaching out to the Jewish community, offering maybe teacher training seminars in the museum and maybe doing things like that. Then there's all kinds of collaborations. So there's, let's say, Project 929, which also has 929 English, 929 chapters in the Bible. That's according to the Christian division. So that's just the name of a sort of initiative for studying Tanakh in different ways, engaging people across religious affiliations.
Tanakh, by the way, for those who don't know, sorry, Tanakh is
Yes.
the Hebrew.
Hebrew Bible.
In Hebrew, it's the Hebrew Bible. Yeah.
Right. So the Tanakh is the Hebrew Bible, and to maybe do some things with them. I met with them in their headquarters in 2015 when I thought of doing YouTube. So I'm going to reach out to them. They didn't respond. I'm going to call them again. That's what I do. I cold call and I hustle. And I'm thinking of those collaborations. I also want to add pre-recorded tours. So if you missed a tour, you can go to my website, click it, and there's already a button on my homepage that says, watch a tour, not only book a tour, and that's coming soon. So to work on people being able to just watch a tour that they missed, or maybe I'll have a series of pre-recorded tours that a school can screen instead of waiting for me to be up at 2, 3 in the morning here, which I've done sometimes. They can just download it. So I'm working on a series of those. And then there's some other things which I thought of. I just had this idea. So my friend said, what can you offer to a general audience that's just interested in just like seeing Israel? And I said, like, I'm not a tour guide. I'm a museum guide, right? A tour guide in Israel comes with 2 years of training. It's a very important position in Israel, especially because the reputation of Israel is in your hands. So they're very strict about licensing and insurance and stuff like that. And there's a lot of benefits to being a tour guide here. I hope to do the tour guide course next year. So, but that being said, my friend was like, why not just show them what life is like for an Israeli with all of your stories? I'm like, I do my Instagram stories. I mean, all my Instagram, my Facebook, I do that stuff. And I've built up an audience slowly but surely. But I think that now, going back to what my professor says, now it can be profitable because I've built up the mileage of all these things that I'm doing. So now that I have this capital, so to speak, I can cash in. So I'm not saying that if I open a YouTube channel, if I start being consistent with my YouTube channel, it's going to get me necessarily there. I don't know if that's what I want to do. But my friend told me about HAPS. Now, HAPS is replacing what's called Periscope. And there's some people, I know some Israeli tour guides who are they have thousands and thousands of followers. They just walk around and people watch them. And sometimes they just click or they'll just submit you some money or something like that. I'm like, so I thought of this idea of just walking around. I called it Israel Snapshot. And I just did it today for the second time. I'm just walking around. I have somebody from Italy just follow me, asking me questions. I'm like, you know what? I'm just sharing my walking around the streets of Jerusalem with the world and having fun. And that's another way to connect people who I wouldn't be able to bring into this or to that. And, hopefully one thing will lead to conversion for a product or something, but it doesn't matter. The point is I'm sharing what I'm passionate about in another way. So I have all these different channels, which I hope to build up and build communities around this. And maybe through that show people Israel in a certain way and bring people close. And there's a lot of people who are doing that sort of thing, right?
So you're going to have to follow him on HAPS.
Yeah. So HAPS now, I mean, the HAPS broadcasts to Facebook Live, to YouTube, and to a few other platforms. So, on HAPS, I'm Israel Snapshot, but everything else is called Museum Tours IL. So it's pretty easy to find it. Yeah.
Very cool. We'll link all that in the show notes. Wow, I feel like there's so many other things we can talk about and unpack. Do you have anything in specific, something new you've just launched, or anything you're excited about that you wanna plug or share with the audience? Obviously, not anything that you have to keep under wraps, but anything kind of new, exciting.
Well, the virtual tours on my website now, I'm working on, first of all, the monthly mystery museum. I want to fit into there an Israel snapshot tour that's at a set time, as opposed to where you just log in if you get a notification that I'm live. So I'm going to call it Israel snapshot, and it's going to be under my virtual tours on my homepage. And I'm also working on a series of tours, like a museum week, maybe bi-weekly thing for families with kids, both English and Hebrew speaking. So that's things that I'm looking into right now. In addition to maintaining the monthly mystery museum tour and periodic tours, my aim is to have at least 3 or 4 virtual tours a month. And hopefully the more people we have, I'll have to maybe open up different times, or maybe find a creative solution for it being at more flexible times. Which is really, we have to see what the market wants, what people
Right.
are actually looking for. But yeah, so those are the main things: family tours and monthly mystery museum and Israel snapshot.
Right. And your new site, or you just redid your site, looks fantastic. I'll put that
Thank
in
you.
the show notes. Nachliel, thank you so much. You've been a really interesting guest and really fun to talk to. Thank you for coming on and sharing with us.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show, Zev.
My pleasure.
All right, have a good one.